Welcome to a new edition of CIDOB In Conversation with. Today with a very special person. It's an honor to have Maria Ressa with us.
It's good
Thank
to
you
be
very
here.
much.
No, thanks for having me.
Maria Ressa is a journalist, but she is a symbol of the fight for press freedom. Don't you like to be
No,
considered that? No?
it's hard. It means these are tough times, right?
It is, it is. For freedom of the press, for freedom of speech. In fact, Maria Ressa was awarded also the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021, also for her fight for freedom of speech. And she was awarded together with a Russian journalist, Dmitry Muratov. Yes. What meant that for you? For someone who has been fighting as a journalist, but in a very hard situation in Philippines against the Duterte regime.
I mean, everything turned upside down starting in 2016. And the fact that the Nobel Peace Prize was given to journalists in 2021, I think just showed you what these times require from journalists, right? And I think in the Philippines, our struggle was to continue doing our jobs. I tried very hard. The words that you were using, a fighter, I thought about journalism as giving you the way things look. It is neither for nor against. It is. It just is, right? And so some people will say I'm anti-Duterte. I'm not anti-Duterte. I'm a journalist who'll give you here is the line of our constitution, which guarantees our rights. And under Duterte, he took a bulldozer and used the state's power to try to push us off the line so that we voluntarily give up our rights. Our goal was not to, and as journalists, to keep doing our jobs, to keep holding him to account, his administration, despite the fact that he intimidated, harassed, he hung a Damocles sword over journalists and made it clear that if you kept asking him questions he didn't want to answer, there would be repercussions. There were. We survived, which is good. So in that sense, I think it was a gift to journalists, a recognition that we have sacrificed a lot, but also to Filipinos and to Rapplers. It's a recognition that doing the right thing is the right thing.
We will talk about this today. We will talk about journalism, freedom of speech. We want to talk about democracy in crisis, in fact, and how social networks have changed the framework completely, where journalism, but also where opinion making happens.
Yeah.
So let's start with democracy, if you don't mind. Mainly because we have the opportunity to talk to you because you come with your recent published book, How to Stand Up to a Dictator. So this is something that we can talk about it. But I was reading recently that 70% of the global population lives under a dictatorship or under autocracies. So this is 5,000 million people who have no rights or freedoms. So we've been talking for a long time about this decline on democracies, but are we aware really of what is the state of democracies as a global concern? And even are we aware of the state of those democratic governments who are now being also challenged, who were not able to fight, for instance, or to counter inequalities, who are every time more, I don't know, witnessing this social discontent, this political discontent among populations. So there is really a distress inside democratic governments or democratic societies too.
I'll take them apart, right? I think in terms of the old world, the ideas of democratic governments, right? In the old world, I mean, look at the UN. We came out with the Sustainable Development Goals. 2020 now is actually 2023?
2023.
2023. So 2023 was the goal, and it was a long enough time period to deal with getting rid of poverty, climate change issues, right? All of the things that 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 we collectively as a world wanted to. Except the biggest problem was around 2014 to 2016, our information ecosystem changed. And this is part of what in the book I call it death by a thousand cuts of our democracy, because around 2014, news organizations, journalists who were in charge of protecting the public sphere, right? We were sources of information. We controlled both the creation of the news and the distribution of the news. And we were liable, legally liable. If you were sorting out, if you were distributing lies, you can get sued. And there was accountability. Once technology took over as the gatekeepers, the irony, of course, is they were American technology firms. They essentially abdicated responsibility for protecting the public sphere. And then if you go by MIT's study in 2018, the design of the information ecosystem fundamentally shifted because they said that lies spread at least 6 times faster than facts. Those facts, they're really boring. I mean, journalists have known this for a long time. We spend our careers learning how to make facts interesting so that you care. And here we go, social media, American companies at that point, they decide that because they want greater engagement, because they want more money in a system, an entirely new business model that uses our biology against us to keep us scrolling. We didn't even have a name for it until 2019. Now we know it's called surveillance capitalism. They abdicated responsibility. So now you walk into our information ecosystem and facts are lies and lies are facts. The world is upside down. And, I always wind up saying this is like the Netflix series Stranger Things.
Yes.
We're in the upside down. Mm-hmm. It's the incentive structure. So imagine if you tell your child, lie, I'll reward you. And then you keep saying, lie all the time and I'll reward you. That's the incentive structure of our information ecosystem today. Is it any wonder that we don't have, that our democracies have regressed, and that we are electing illiberal leaders democratically? I'll do the link there, right? If lies spread faster, there's 3 sentences I've said over and over since 2016. If you don't have facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. If you don't have these three, you have no shared reality. You can't solve any problems like climate change. You cannot have democracy. Then take it one step further. If you don't have integrity of facts, how can you have integrity of elections? So what's happened in the last, and we've seen all of the indicators, right? The World Press Freedom Index, you have the rankings of democracy. Over the last decade, all of these have regressed. But the biggest problem is that if our information ecosystem allows the, what's the right word? It allows the manipulation at the cellular level of a democracy. That is at the each person level, right? Like, so intelligence operations couldn't work like this. It would take time and you wouldn't be able to hit 124 million Americans, which, by the way, is a 2016 report that said that this is how Russian disinformation attacked the 2016 elections. So if you can manipulate at the cellular level so easily and so cheaply, this is what started as a marketing and advertising platform became a vector for geopolitical power to manipulate and tear apart democracy. What we saw in the United States in 2016 was a targeting of the fissure lines of American society. Identity politics, Black Lives Matter, Russian disinformation hit both sides. And what's the goal? To pound open a fracture line and have America tear itself apart, which is essentially to a degree what we saw of identity politics, not just in America, but all around the world. Okay, so you now are able to elect illiberal leaders democratically. Once they get in power, they crush institutions of democracy from within, but they don't stop there. They go a step further and they ally with each other, shifting geopolitical power balance. Right? I don't know where our
Yeah,
balance is now, right?
but the problem is that in this long explanation, there are so many different factors in it. I mean, there are so many different changes, and it's some even are a little bit contradictory.
Please.
Because the first one is that, of course, because of internet, there is this disintermediation process. So journalists lost the monopoly to explain what was happening, but also the political parties lost that monopoly because everyone had the possibility to give an opinion, to have a capacity to influence, which was positive in a certain way.
That was
that was
2011
but
to 2014.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And then everything changes.
Yeah.
Because those who lost the monopoly, for instance, certain political parties, certain political leaders, they learn how to use the tool also to gain this influence. And I think here the press started to go a little bit behind because in that moment there was also some kind of it was a very difficult moment from a business model perspective for the press. So they needed also the bites, they need the attention. So they were buying also some of these new game or roles in a way. And then they had to learn that this was at the end a little bit the crisis for everyone. There was also a crisis for the press, for the traditional media, for those who really wanted to keep on doing journalism, because content had become something else.
But
than
I'll take
journalism.
apart the three parts
Yes.
that you just said, right? The reason why I zoom in on the fundamental design is all of that will be okay if you don't reward lies, right? Because the minute you reward lies, you change the incentive structure of the entire world. I became a journalist because information is power. We just shifted the values of the world for the tech companies, not for society.
Exactly, exactly. So
But
at the end of the day, there is very asymmetrical power. So we have governments who use social networks, but those who have the algorithm to decide what are we going to be fed, these are the technological companies.
yes. But let's do two things, right? We'll take the governments separately still. Like the second part is you talked about news organizations. Most traditional news groups were late coming to it, but this is I went from managing the largest news organization in the Philippines to a startup, precisely because we could see this is the point when the Arab Spring had just happened. Wael Gonim, who was working with Google, began warning of the Arab winter around 2014, 2013, 2014. So it wasn't that news organizations, look, I don't think it's like, it's not an envy of the tech. I embraced the tech. I believed in the tech better than they did. I knew what Facebook was doing in the Philippines better than Facebook. But the problem is when it became the gatekeepers, it rewarded the liar. The foundation of every democracy is transparency. The foundation of transparency is actually honesty. This is what I was trying. So I go back to that. But the other part is where news organizations and where the business model flipped was when on the website we outsourced the share button. Right? By putting the technology company share button on our news sites, we just gave them all of our data. We didn't know that then. That would have been around 2012. Around 2012. So, but by 2014, the information operations were full force. And it started with Russia. Russia really was they were the startup that started, and their primary meta-narrative that they were looking at was Crimea, the same meta-narrative that they used to invade Ukraine in 2022, 8 years later. Okay, so the first government was the last one. You said some then governments take it apart. Here's the thing: if the incentive structure are lies, if you're a good leader, a leader that wants to be transparent and accountable, you're not going to lie. You're not going to incite hate. I think even worse than that is that, that MIT study talked about lies spreading 6 times faster, but what we saw in the Philippines is if it's laced with fear, anger, and hate, it spreads even faster. So you had at that time period groups that then had they chased the virality. So Upworthy, you had startups like BuzzFeed, for example, came up at that time period. But this design undermines good journalism because it rewards the lies. It undermines good governance because it rewards the liar. And so if you're actually trying to do good journalism, the incentive structure is for bad journalism. If you're trying to govern, if you have no values or ethics as a leader, you would do better because then you can lie and spread your message. Here's the problem for every leader trying to hold their democracy together. How do you fight against enemies who have who don't care about the future, enemies who lie all the time? It's what kind of kids? I always say it's almost like you're the parent and then you told your kids lie and I'll reward you. These are the types of societies we've created. This is how these companies have made so much money and continue to make so much money. So I go back to that, right? I don't think everything else is part of the cascading failure, right? Are journalists perfect? Definitely not. But journalists are accountable. And if you make a mistake, you have a corrections page that you put it in. The kinds of insidious manipulation of our data that the tech companies have done, literally cloning us and then taking that up and then using AI to use that to micro-target us, these are all violations. I mean, you need to pull together the data privacy, antitrust, there's no user safety, content moderation, all of these things need to be pulled together. Sorry, they're all...
No, but I agree with that. The problem is that how can you create the legal framework for that when you're dealing with transnational companies, when there is no shared approach to what internet means nowadays, because it depends on if you are a democratic society or if this is an autocracy. So how can you put some limits on that?
You have to have the gatekeepers be accountable. And in the Nobel lecture, I was very straightforward: reform or revoke Section 230, right? By giving the tech companies a free pass for them not being responsible for the manipulation, because they create the algorithms. And what's an algorithm? It's opinion in code. It's like they took an editor and replicated the editor 1,000,000 times, and then they decided, oh, let me just make the most money I can, so it doesn't matter if I spread the lies, because I'm not accountable anyway. If you stop the impunity, transparency can happen. Right now, as long as Section 230 exists, and this is all a U.S. law, right?
Yes.
It's the
Yeah.
1996 Communications Decency Act. By having that in place, America dictated to the rest of the world that lies will spread faster than facts.
Yeah.
The EU now it's going to be interesting what they're doing with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act.
Yeah.
But
this is the first attempt to create a legal framework, and it's also
using algorithms.
challenging. Yeah, algorithms. Cathy O'Neill mentioned algorithms are mathematics, weapons of mathematics.
Of math destruction. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And so the European Union is asking for some more transparency also on the algorithms.
Yeah.
of course, the problem is how can you be sure that this algorithm will exist? How can you be sure that there is this accountability? And also, how can you make some companies accountable in Europe and not on the rest of the world, for instance? That's another of the questions. And then again, also, if you give to these tech companies the power to regulate, to have some control on the content, of course, they are becoming the gatekeepers of the freedom of speech. And that's some kind of power to censor.
They already have.
And they
They're
are
using
doing
this
that.
power
And they
now.
are doing that. So
For the worse,
far. And in that case, I've seen an evolution on how the EU institutions approach to how to fight disinformation. And it's less related to content and more related to algorithm and strategies. Because at the end of the day, there is a big risk to fight disinformation also hurting or damaging freedom of speech.
I think that's a tech lobby push. You know, as of last year, I think the tech companies have spent $70 million to lobby, and their narrative is that this is freedom of speech. It is not a freedom of speech issue. It is, a comedian said this many years ago, Sacha Baron Cohen. He said, it's a freedom of reach issue,
That
not
was a very
freedom
good
of speech.
speech
It
from
was
Sacha
at the
Baron Cohen.
Anti-Defamation League,
I
right?
remember that.
So it is about transparency of algorithms.
And it's the same narrative that anonymity is freedom of speech.
Yeah.
That's the recent one.
I had just UNESCO had just done this gathering in Paris where, you know, we're talking about legislation, and this is, look, I hope that what the EU does spreads globally, because certainly the platforms, the tech platforms, tend to do a one size fits all, right? They use something that works in wealthy countries. Never mind that most of the damage happens in the poorer global south. Never mind that there's genocide in Myanmar, right? That's something that both the UN and Meta, they sent people to Myanmar. They come out realizing that that platform, Facebook, enabled genocide. How can you not change it? So this is, well, look, I think you're right that it is in the algorithms, but part of what we were discussing in Paris is, so how do we make transparency of these tech platforms as every day of an event, as reading an article? And I think this means that the EU is going to need to require real-time data moving into a UX where you can see the patterns, and we need to educate. I mean, ultimately, in the book I talk about, in the long term, it's education. In the medium term, it's legislation. And in the short term, it's just us. We need a whole of society approach. We need to redefine what civic engagement is in the age of exponential lies. We're in transition though, right? So it's tough. But Europe, the EU, is winning the race of the turtles to protect us online and to help redefine what the internet looks like in the 21st century. An internet that values human rights and that values the principles of democracy, because this one does not.
Well, and you really need to have this base clear in internet, because then you will need the same for artificial intelligence.
It
so
will
it's
get worse.
better if you already have this ethics approach
Yes.
Since the beginning. Okay, so we have the platforms already and we have them accountable, but I would like to, or we would like to have them accountable, but I would like to go a little bit further on the idea of how these platforms have been also affecting social movements, how they have been a tool and some kind of course for global protest, because they were a tool to gather people.
Yep.
But then they were a tool to polarize people.
Yep.
They were a tool to take your attention from one cause to another.
Yep.
So we have more protests than ever, and we have the feeling that there is less capacity to make real changes.
Yep. And that's a study that came out,
Yeah,
right? That
and
just
at
showed that
Harvard
there are
University,
more
yes,
protests,
exactly.
but yet the
Yeah,
actual
yeah,
ability to change systems has gotten less.
yes.
It's a great question. So I think the first part is you have to look at the development over time, because some of the studies come at different times and they capture different moments. At the beginning, 2011 going into 2014, it was an internet that enabled voices to come up, that helped enable this Arab Spring, right? This is why we created Rappler in 2012, a year after the Arab Spring. It was a tool of empowerment at that point. But that was when you had a linear feed. Twitter, and they each had different roles, right? Twitter was the global diaspora. It was the global public sphere. And that was where you could do hashtag protest movements. This is also where the Arab Spring happened, right?
Yes.
Facebook was slightly different because Facebook used algorithmic distribution. YouTube was also slightly different. Those three. If you look at YouTube, and this is significantly like around in Brazil, I'm trying to remember which Harvard professor, Harvard study that showed that the algorithms, the clustering algorithms of the recommendation videos, the recommendation engine, actually created, lumped together, so it clustered the far right with conspiracy theorists, literally creating the support base for Bolsonaro, dragging Bolsonaro from the far left all the way to president. And that's still there. So, I'm trying to remember his name. Oh, well, that study from Harvard then also began to posit that this is the same thing that happened with President Trump, right? That the base. So, all right, so we had at the beginning until 2014, this is when you had empowerment, the ability to empower. Then you had 2014 to 2016. I think this is a different phase. This is the phase when Russia began experimenting with information operations. It's also the phase where governments began to realize that they could exploit these very tools, right? And let's start with Egypt. When citizens and students and all the disparate groups were able to use social media to unseat a government, the government realized, the illiberal governments realized they could use this tool as well. And they had far more resources and far more power than the students who did it before. So by 2014, you were already beginning to see the beginning of the Arab winter. When the transition happened, the government was coming back in to use the very tools. That was around the time that Russian information operations were working to annex Crimea, the same meta-narrative that it used 8 years later. It was also 2014 when Ferdinand Marcos Jr., began the information operations that literally changed history in front of our eyes, turning the name Marcos from a kleptocrat, ousted in a people power revolt 37 years ago this month, to the Philippines' greatest leader that we've ever had. It all began around that. So 2014 to 2016 was when the political dominoes began to fall. So 2014 to 2016 were all the experiments. By 2016, you had Duterte elected in the Philippines. About a month later, you had Brexit. Then you had elections coming up, going to Trump, the Catalonia elections, which were seeded with so many Russian bots, right? So then you had the elections coming in, and then by the time 2015 rolled around, which is when Facebook introduced instant articles, I think that was when they really doomed facts and threw it into this like witch's brew of chaos. And then they brought news organizations in through instant articles, but they never changed the algorithms. And those algorithms then spread lies over facts. That was the beginning of the end for, well, the death of 1,000 cuts of our democracies.
Yeah, and we could add also the reaction during the pandemic, where many laws, in principle, to fight disinformation were approved, that in reality were laws to diminish freedom of speech, to diminish the plurality of the press, the media. So in fact, there were laws that in fact they were punishing dissent more than disinformation.
Give me an example.
For instance, in Hungary, in the European Union, so they approve certain laws to fight against disinformation.
This is for COVID.
And
Yeah.
they were laws, in
Yeah.
fact, fighting political dissent and not disinformation.
But I would say the COVID time. So we've known that the principles, again, the design of these social media platforms enabled the rise of conspiracy theories, right? So like, let's look at health issues before COVID. In the Philippines and other states in the United States, the anti-vaxxers were kicking up. And what we saw in the Philippines were incidents of the measles rose 3 times as anti-vaxxers increased, spread by the social media platforms, right? This is before COVID, so this would have been around 2018 or 2019. By the time the COVID lockdowns began, I saw it on both sides. I saw initiatives that were taken. Yes, Hungary, I think at one point even Israel came through with some laws that were restrictive, right? But so did Facebook. In the Philippines, in the book, I actually lay out, Facebook did something during the lockdowns where they gave the Department of Health in the Philippines, and this was a global push, right? They gave the Department of Health more power. So that meant that they grew faster, right? But when they did that in the Philippines, because we had the data from the information ecosystem, they also gave more power to the police and the military. The police who were literally targeting activists and the media, right? So we call it red tagging in the Philippines because they call you a terrorist and then they die. There was one human rights group, Karapatan, that lost 15 people dead during the time of Duterte, right?
Yeah.
Following red tagging. So I think it's not just governments. During the time of COVID, because part of it was no one was accountable. Again, I go back to accountability, right? How can you hold them accountable? How can you hold Russia accountable for invading Ukraine, right? So this is part of, I think these are all part of the erosion of the information ecosystem. If it was very clear who is responsible, then we can begin to hold different things. I don't think it is just a government
But
problem.
do you have an answer for who can keep them accountable?
I specifically say right now, you cannot hold governments accountable if we don't have integrity of facts, which means get rid of Section 230, right? The very first thing is, in this, the dictator,
Yes.
I mean, I'm not just talking about who's the biggest dictator today, right? In here, the impunity that we feel that has rippled through Philippine society
Yeah.
is Mark Zuckerberg's impunity.
Yeah.
They are aware of the harms. They're aware of the harms against journalists individually. The amount of attacks I've had to deal with, which no one is responsible for, and yet I know who should be responsible for this, right? There's no sense of justice in that. There's a free pass. So let's stop the impunity first. Once you have that, then you restore integrity to the information ecosystem. When you spread lies over facts, you turn everything upside down. It's cascading failures. The governments that exploit that were illiberal or dictatorial to begin with. And you leave democratic states with far fewer options at their hand, right? In the EU, when we've had discussions with them, this is funny. One of the questions that they asked was, did we do the right thing in banning RT? Yes, absolutely. This is part of the problem, right? Why would they not? Look, I do not think this is a freedom of speech issue. This goes right back again to calling a spade a spade. This is what a journalist does. If it's propaganda, I will call it propaganda. If Duterte lies, if Trump lies, Rappler called it a lie. Our inability to shoot the arrow straight is part of what has twisted the environment as well. We are already in the upside down, and then when we get lost, we compound the cascading failures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But sometimes I have also the feeling that for institutions or for politicians, they insist a lot on this idea of battle of narratives. And
It
this is
isn't.
also, yeah,
This is
but
like the battle of climate change.
yeah, well, but climate change exists.
Exactly.
And I think that the problem is that sometimes it's more about a fight for hegemonies, and everyone is using sometimes this information in a way that can serve them.
I think that's a given. But the reality is don't allow it. Right? It's like if lies don't spread fast, that's why I go back. These are all cascading failures. And so many times we look for solution down here when we should be heading upstream, right? I actually said, you know, content moderation is like taking water from the river, cleaning it up, and then dumping it back in the river. The
Yeah.
river is still polluted. Go all the way upstream and stop the factory. So let's stop the factory. Once you stop the factory, then journalists can go back to doing our jobs of holding governments accountable. Hungary is an interesting one, right? Because gosh, how interesting. I mean, one, you're seeing the media capture, but you're also seeing journalists still standing up. Hungary is also not as social media, they don't get their news from social media the same way Filipinos do. So traditional media and media capture is still different. It's much
Yes.
more like Russia. The fact that Viktor Orban has put white replacement theory as part of state ideology, that should be a warning sign to democratic governments, right? White replacement theory in democratic, in its, oh my gosh. Well, anyway, what was fascinating to me is last year, the, the CPAC, the Republican Party, actually held its annual meeting in Hungary and asked Viktor Orban to speak. White replacement theory is a version of I don't even know what to call it. It's a version, it's a back to the future to a past that we had, that we know how it ends. It's an us against them that will tear the world apart. And that not enough governments have spoken against it. All right, I
Yeah,
should shut up about
no, but it's true
Orban.
that what it has happened is that this has enabled the possibility to homologate or normalize certain narratives that used to be really fringe. And now they have a loudspeaker much bigger than they had in history, probably. So this is something happening.
But that's why I hold the platforms accountable.
Yes. But
Would Bolsonaro have been elected without YouTube, without Facebook? Probably not. Would Zika have been, would the anti-vaxxers have grown to the degree that they have? Probably not, because again, you have which then gets even worse when you go into the COVID lockdown. Anyway, like in the Philippines, Duterte would have been elected. But could could his administration have killed as many people? Probably not. Would I have had 10 arrest warrants in less than 2 years? Probably not, right? The, the book is very experiential because we have lived through this. I saw how social media was weaponized, and that was followed. The bottom up lies were followed top down by government lies and the weaponization of the law. And once that happened, it took so much to just be able to do our jobs.
yeah, that's also, this is why I would like to end up, because we've talked a lot about the tech companies and a lot about governments, and I would like to talk about citizens.
Yeah.
And with them to talk also about journalists who are citizens also.
Yeah, yeah.
Many times paying with their lives. Mexico is a clear example on how hard it is to be a journalist nowadays in certain countries. So I would like to talk to the citizens, how this is changing, how citizens believe, relate, also engage, because this is really affecting the whole society. In fact, this is also this has been studied. Disinformation normally what does is to exploit pre-existing vulnerabilities. So what they really do is to highlight or enlarge those that were already, those
Vulnerable.
weakness or
Yeah.
vulnerabilities being there. So what it makes is people more vulnerable in general. So how can citizens deal with that, in fact?
So many different strands to pull in that, right? So if you were vulnerable in the physical world, you become doubly so in the virtual world, right?
True.
Women, LGBTQ plus, we have women have the amount of sexism and misogyny online has forced women journalists, women politicians, women researchers out of the field because they don't want to deal with it. Okay, how do we deal with citizens? There's so many different strands we can pull together now, right? Let me pull up because everything else can be shifted through politics. And I think that's part of the problem. People look at this debate as political when it isn't. This is technical, it is technological. So let's go back to what happens when by design these social media platforms spread lies over facts, when they want you to keep scrolling, when it is the attention economy, right? I mean, there have only been two instances where, and this is why I'm still optimistic. The last time humans were commodified was labor, the end of the 18th century. In the 18th, 19th century,
Yes.
you had the robber barons. They found out that, oh my gosh, we can keep factories going, then sweatshops and child labor. And what happened? Unions were formed, governments created legislation, and those robber barons wound up giving money for education and public libraries because they knew what they did wrong. Fast forward to the attention economy, where they capture our minds, our hearts, and our emotions, right? They use our biology against us. This design that ostensibly just gives more money to the tech platforms and keeps us scrolling impacts on three levels. And you talked about them a little bit. The first is really the personal level. There is a change in each person on social media. Our attention span, for the first, right? You've gone from the time when I was a broadcast journalist, when our attention, I was told you have to get the attention of someone in the first 10 seconds. Fast forward to today, where we have the attention span of a goldfish, 3 seconds, right? So there's the impact at a personal, psychological level, which is part of what you brought up. We have our higher levels of depression, higher for young teenage girls, higher incidence of eating disorders, higher levels of suicides, right? I mean, the first book on this was Alone Together, I think Sherry Turk, many years ago, but it's gotten worse. The dopamine nation, the fact that these are mildly addictive and plays with our biology again, changes it. So personal level, that's like the stuff that is not, that we're not even aware of. Then you look at the cognitive biases. When the person is targeted, and how do they target us? Using our own clone, right? When they micro-target our weakest moment, it plays right into our cognitive biases. And what's happened at a personal level? January 6 in the United States, January 8 in Brazil, the rise of identity politics, where we tear ourselves apart at a societal level. Okay, personal. Second, sociological level. The impact on groups is really different. And in the book, I talk a lot about mob rule in Indonesia, in the physical world. But now mob rule online is something that is designed in there, right? They put no safeguards in place. In Indonesia, this part was taken out of there, but I just remember being in Ambon. Ambon, which for centuries is 50% Muslim, 49 or 50% Muslim and Christian. They lived in harmony for centuries. And then here comes the instigator, and we end up with thousands of people killed in a short period of time, beginning in 1999 after the fall of Suharto. The mob rule came out in Indonesia, and I think mob rule online is a hop, skip, and a jump and far more potent. Leading to the last part, which is evolutionary, it's emergent human behavior. We have no idea how this is changing, rewiring our brains, and shifting us as a species. Now I sound really back to the science. We have the shorter attention spans. The emergent behavior is something that you cannot predict from the behavior of one individuals. So what we are seeing is in real time, without any boundaries or guidelines for the tech companies, especially with ChatGPT coming up, with artificial intelligence, talking to your vulnerable moments, right? I mean, writing to this, engaging with you at that level, and you don't even know whether it's real or not. It could be hallucinating, that's their word, right? This is an AI that has been fed an internet that doesn't distinguish fact from fiction on social media. Anyway, sorry. So the last part is that emergent behavior prioritizes. In the Nobel lecture, I talked about toxic sludge. It incites hate. It almost kills the good of humanity and is shifting us as a species. This we need more studies on, but it's alarming. It's worrisome at the very least.
Yeah, so then to wrap up a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, it's all.
No, sorry. We could stay longer, but you had a very long day. I'm
No, it's
aware of
okay.
that. No, but there is a moment in the book when you explain how you were aware for the first time of the erosion of social contract in the US.
Yeah.
And that made me think also, because we are in this moment of discontent, we are in this moment of vulnerability, when there are so many things changing, when all those changes are really affecting our rights. So are we just coming into a moment where we do need a new social contract? Where do we need to find, for instance, to redefine human rights to try to adapt to all these changes?
So interesting. The UN was created because humanity was on the verge of extinction. Of the atom bomb gave us the power to destroy our world, right? And we knew we needed to come together. This time around, I called it a silent atom bomb. I don't think it's about like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We signed on to it. The only thing that changed is the fire hose of lies, right? That's why I go back, because I think we're dealing with cascading failures. If you lie all the time, then what kind of human being do you become? And what kind of societies do you create, right? So I think that the struggle that we have now is that fascism is on the rise. I mean, white replacement theory, again, you go back. Fascism is on the rise. We have been here before. We came out of it because the humanity realized what was happening. We now have a conventional war. It's a country that never accepted the history post-World War II, right? And it's come back. So this is, in a way, a back to the future moment. Will democratic nations wake up with enough time to fix the problem? And I go back, I simplify in my head.
Will they?
If you revoke Section 230, for me, it's very simple. If you make those companies, because now you have China and TikTok, ByteDance, right, which is captured so much. I mean, if Facebook was a blunt mallet, TikTok is a surgical probe. And I think that if we can stop the cascading failure, if we can stop the factory from spewing out lies, then we can move at the pace of human comprehension to fix what was broken. But it's not going to be fast. Like a drug addiction, I hate to say, it will take time, because The people who went out on January 6th believed it. The people who went out in Brazil on January 8th believe it, right? These are, so sorry, back to your question of how do we do this now? Stop the impunity. If we fix that, how do we get there? America itself is divided. You've never had a president do an op-ed on disinformation. So at least it's identified the problem. The question is, I guess I never really realized when you said, it's a social contract. When you said that, I knew the moment when I realized this. This was the fall of Suharto, when nobody was following the traffic lights in Jakarta. Nothing, right? It's like it's blinking, it's red, but people were just bashing through. We all decide to follow these rules, rule of law. And now we're at this moment where the rules have changed. So let's reinstate rules that will allow humanity to exist, that will allow societies to exist. And I go back to facts. Because if we don't have facts, we can't have anything else. Facts create our shared reality. So I simplified it, right? That's part of what I simplified in the book because I'm a journalist. I'm not going to get lost in governments, because the governments are almost the tail wagging the dog, right? They're a result of the cascading failure of the information ecosystem. We're electing illiberal leaders partly because lies are spreading faster than facts. And in every country around the world where there are elections, the good guys are trying to figure out how to use social media or to stop social media from spreading lies. Let's stop that first.
We end where we started, in fact.
I'm obsessed about it, am I not?
Because
I'm too adamant.
Because there's still a lot to do, and the consequences are every time bigger and bigger. So it's a fact that I really enjoyed this conversation,
No,
that
thank
we are
you.
grateful that you could dedicate all this time to CIDOB. Thank you very much, Maria Ressa. It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you.